Before that, just to give you a little bit quickly about myself and why I'm here today, is I actually was with the UAW for many, many years and helped organize and bargain contracts at NYU and the new school for grad employees and part-time faculty and adjuncts. So I have a certain affinity to the subject matter of the professions here today. And I'm going to just quickly introduce the panelists. You can read their fuller bios in the, I guess, did you all download the app? You know, the app, what it's called. You can all read their fuller bios there, but I'm still in the order in which they're sitting, not necessarily the order they can speak. Next to me is Elizabeth Vignaux. Vignaux, sorry about that. Who is a labor relations specialist with the New York State United Teachers. She's been there for more than 25 years. She's done a lot of bargaining, advocacy, and actions to help local enforce contracts and engaging in effective quality labor management practices. Before that, she worked with state workers and healthcare professionals, and this helped her, mold her tactics in effective labor management processes. And she is president of the Professional Staff Union at NYSUT. So that's Elizabeth. Next to her is Pam Silverblatt from Bond, Schoeneck, and King, senior counsel there, but some of you may know her in this room. Before that, she was a vice chancellor for labor relations at a small little operation here in town called the City University of New York. And in that job, of course, had to handle a whole wide range of strategies dealing with, how many campuses does CUNY have these days?
25.
25? Yeah, like around 25, senior colleges and also obviously community colleges. So obviously she brings a wide breadth of experience in dealing with over a dozen unions and whatever. So it's we're happy to have her with us today. Also coming from Buffalo, Fred Floss is the former chair of the Department of Economics at Buffalo State College. And he specializes both economics and finance, including labor economics and labor relations, microeconomic theory, something I have not said since my first year of college at SUNY Albany, econometrics, public finance, investments, and portfolio. And Fred also has a deep labor background himself, as he was the statewide president and vice president of academics for the United University Professions, and he also was their chief negotiator for their 2007-2011 contract, which represented 37,000 academic professional faculty at the SUNY system. Our last person all the way over to my left, John Gross, from Ingerman and Smith. John graciously agreed to join our panel on Friday when our other John had to back out because of a work emergency that arose. John's with Ingerman and Smith, which is based out in Long Island, and he's a graduate of the ILR school and an attorney, Cornell Law School. He's done a lot of negotiations, public sector, labor relations, private sector, education law, and has also himself been an adjunct professor, so he's familiar obviously with some of the area we're talking about today, and has one of his clients, which I think we'll talk about later, is Nassau Community College. So we're here today to talk about best practices in collective bargaining. I think what we're going to do is we're going to have the panelists speak a little bit each, and they may throw out a question or two. They may have questions for each other to get the conversation going, and of course we'll take as many questions as time permits from the floor. Everyone can hear us fine together, right? And we can see well? Okay, great. So with that, I think we're going to start with Pam.
I think I'm starting.
Okay.
So, thanks, Scott. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to CUNY. I think I'm good with this.
Okay.
Welcome to CUNY. Thank you. Thanks, Scott, for moderating us. And as Scott said, this for a long time, CUNY was my home. Just a bit of disclaimer, I spent 15 years and 5 chancellors as the Vice Chancellor for Labor Relations and the Chief Labor Negotiator and Chief Spokesperson at CUNY. I retired last spring and joined a law firm, but the thoughts this afternoon and comments are solely my own. So full disclaimer, not speaking for anybody but myself. But what I wanted to do was, I think, just share a couple of observations from a large system perspective, from the dual role of being both the chief negotiator and the person responsible for managing labor relations across the system, So for those that don't know CUNY, at the moment in time that I was here, we probably had about 250,000 degree-seeking students, an equal number of non-degree seeking students. As Scott said, 25 colleges, which 11 senior colleges, 7 community colleges, 7 professional schools, including law, medicine, public health, journalism, and all of that consolidated into what I like to refer to as one omnibus collective bargaining agreement. So the tenure and tenure track faculty, the adjunct faculty, the counselors, the librarians, all of the adjunct staff, all the adjunct faculty in all of the titles, and the professional staff were in the same collective bargaining unit, covered by the same collective bargaining representative, and that contract was negotiated at the same time by the same representatives at the same table as a complete and comprehensive agreement. And I say that for you to understand that the union had many, many constituencies that they had to represent, and on the management side, one needed to be mindful that all of those constituencies had issues that, in the context of getting through a round of bargaining, were going to have issues that needed to be addressed. So just to kind of give you a framework for what that looked like. And I would say in terms of best practices that every institution, every culture, every round of bargaining has certain basic concepts that are the same and that are transcendent. Thorough preparation, educating principals, carefully selecting your bargaining team, appropriately soliciting input, having credible relationships. You know, the basic precepts and principles are transcendent. But there are certain things that I do think are unique in managing a large system. And I want to comment, I think, principally on 2 pieces. That if you sit in the role of chief negotiator and chief labor spokesperson, and you do that as an in-house administrator, not necessarily as an outside counsel, you need to be particularly focused on. And I think that these may be invisible to people on the outside. And so one of them is your invisible constituencies. And when I say that, I talk about managing the presidents or your college heads across the university. So when you think about the constituencies, you're thinking about, you know, your chancellor or whoever your system head is, your trustees that you're answerable to. But in a large system, each of your colleges or each of your campuses has someone who runs that unit, that college, whether you call them president or a chancellor, depending on how your system is structured. And that person in most institutions, I think CUNY not that different from CSU, not different from the UC system, all large systems. That person, by the time they sit in that role, has probably been an associate professor, they've probably been a full professor, they've probably been a department chair. A lot of times they've been a distinguished professor, they have been a college provost probably, and they are used to having their opinion considered, they are used to being consulted, they are used to having a fair amount of sway. And when you're bargaining for a large system, they don't necessarily have a lot of input. And I think that part of what you have to figure out how to do is you have to figure out how to engage the people that are sitting in those very, very important chairs in your system. And if you don't, it's to your detriment. And I spent a lot of time sitting in my role here at CUNY trying to figure out how to engage those leaders, how to solicit input from them before the round of bargaining started, how to incorporate their thoughts, how to brief them in advance, how to educate them about everything from what the bargaining agenda was going to look like, what the bargaining proposals were going to look like, what the funding was going to look like, because the truth is they weren't going to control the funding, they weren't going to have a lot of say in what the ultimate package was going to look like. They weren't going to have a lot of say in where the money got spent. They weren't going to have a lot of say in what the raises for the employees looked like. They weren't going to have a lot of say in a whole lot at the end of the day. And yet they were going to have a lot of behind-the-scenes ability to talk about whether they thought it was a good contract, not a good contract, served their needs, didn't serve their needs, served the institution's needs, was good for the faculty, was good for the students. And so I think that that piece of knowing and understanding and figuring out who the invisible constituencies are is critically important to the success of the person sitting in the chief negotiator role or the person who's managing the in-house process if you're using an outside chief negotiator. And I think that's an oft overlooked role, particularly in those institutions where you're not using someone in-house. You think that the only thing that you have to worry about is the relationship across the table, the relationship with the union. But the reality is that those presidents across your system have a fair amount of sway. They, especially in a place like CUNY, where they can be politically connected throughout the city. They have their own power bases. They have the ability to whisper in people's ears. And not only can they make or break your contract, but they have a fair amount of say over what they think of the person who's sitting in your chair and how you're doing your job. So I think that that is, I would say, perhaps not a best practice at the bargaining table, but certainly a best practice to think about in how you shape your job and your role, because I think it drives your success. And so that's one big piece that I think folks don't necessarily give a lot of thought to. And then the other piece that is a bit of a corollary to that I also in the role chose to spend, I would say, an inordinate amount of time on, is cross-campus management. And the cross-campus management going both into sort of those invisible constituencies, but also similar constituencies at all levels in all disciplines. So we had standing councils, various standing councils, and I used them very actively. So for example, our presidents met monthly, and we had similar meetings of the chief academic officers and the vice presidents for finance and administration, and the folks who were responsible for labor relations and the folks who were responsible for human resources. And I used those vehicles very, I would say, affirmatively and aggressively as both think tanks and to solicit input and to get information out to the field. And I think that those can be helpful and they can be used to your benefit, and I think if overlooked, they can be a huge detriment. And if they don't exist in large systems, thinking about putting those kinds of mechanisms in place to manage a round of bargaining can be very valuable, because if information is not transmitted out, you really are behind the eight ball. The union is out there, they are communicating, they are telling their membership what's in one form or another, what's going on at the bargaining table. They are talking about what's good, what's bad, what proposals are being made. And while management is likely not going to communicate to the same degree, there's got to be some level of bringing folks along as the negotiations progress. And I think particularly in public institutions where funding is somewhat constrained, if you're not bringing folks along to understand what the funding processes are, what the funding limitations are, who controls the funding, you're going to end up at the end of the day with your whole administrative structure in the field not understanding why you ended up where you did. So I would say those are two big, not visible pieces. I'm just now going to quickly tick through and then stop talking. But in terms of sort of what I consider the obvious And much of this, I think, was covered this morning, but I think while you think about best practices, some things to think about in preparation, you know, all the normal preparation, but part of what you have to think about is when you gauge how far in advance you have to think about preparing in a unionized environment, you need to assess whether your leadership is new leadership or not. Frequently, if you have leadership that has come in that is new to a unionized environment and you have to educate them, you have to start much further in advance than if you have leadership that knows anything about unionization. Anybody on the management or administrative side that has had to break in a president or a chancellor that has come from a non-unionized environment understands exactly what I'm saying. They have no idea that they can't make work rules and change work rules. Right, there you go. That is really something that people don't necessarily think about. So that is a big one. Preparation on the public side, funding sources. You know, are you going to be bound by things like pattern bargaining? Are there other entities that have patterns in place where you're going to be bound by whatever those patterns look like and those funding sources? In terms of your bargaining team, chief negotiator, chief spokesperson, is it somebody inside? Is it outside counsel? How is that person going to interact with the in-house people and the non-in-house people? I would say bargaining process, everything that everybody knows about, ground rules, venue, how frequently you're meeting, all sorts of things like that. My own personal preference is not to fight over ground rules and things like that. I think if you're fighting over ground rules, you're not getting off to a great start. Not a good sign, but that's just me. I think that if you're fighting over where you meet, also not a good sign. I think, again, in terms of an invisibility that somebody who sits in this role needs to be very aware of and not necessarily speak of is where's the power? You need to suss out how much power the person who nominally is running your institution has. Do you have a strong president or chancellor so that they really are giving you directions and it is coming from them, they are speaking for the board, their governance authority? Or is it more likely that they're going to have to be going back and forth to the governance authority to get you marching orders? It's worth knowing that and trying to suss that out in between your sessions at the table. So that's worth knowing. I would say, and this is a hard one, but really it's worth bearing in mind, relationships get built over time. They just don't happen overnight. I don't know what else to say about that. Anybody who's done this for a long time knows that relationships matter. They matter a lot. They probably matter more than just about anything, but they don't happen overnight. And unfortunately or fortunately, collective bargaining is not mergers and acquisitions. You're not wanting to fight to the death. You want to get to an agreement that everybody can live with, everybody can be proud of, and everybody can be a little bit frustrated with. But everybody's got to get the next day and work with each other. Bargaining is an iterative process. One round builds on the prior round. And then I think, just a couple of things that, I think this wasn't mentioned this morning, or at least I didn't hear it mentioned. Did hear some talk, a lot of talk about social justice issues, which I think, fairly new for administrators to have to confront, but certainly with newer bargaining units, graduate and undergraduate students, administrators need to learn to deal with social justice issues, need to learn to receive those issues and engage with those issues and not have knee-jerk negative reactions. I think newer bargaining units, graduate and undergraduate students are not afraid to strike, as we have seen at Rutgers in California, in Chicago, Temple, Michigan, various other places that I won't call out. And so I think administrations need to be really mindful of that. It's a very different landscape. The one thing that I don't think I heard this morning is about communications. Maybe I just missed it. I think that administrations need to focus in ways they didn't used to have to about being prepared on the communications front. Used to be that administrations didn't have to plan very much, I think, in terms of public communications, putting information out. I think that that landscape has changed a lot, and administrations need to think about communicating with their populations, potentially with the public, whether that's through their own websites, whether that's thinking about engaging media consultants. I think that's very different on the administration side than it used to be. Because I think I've run out of time.
Thank you. I think at this point we're going to move to Elizabeth from New York State United Teachers.
How we doing? Still with us? All right. So we agree on some things, which is cool because management, labor, and so forth doesn't always take the same side of things. But I have met a few presidents who didn't understand that they couldn't just do what they wanted, and they're looking for jobs now. So just to put that out there. So at NYSUT, we have 128 labor relations specialists across the state representing all of our members, and those are K-12 educators and support staff as well as higher education. I've had a higher education unit at Erie Community College since 2008, and it has been an eye-opening experience for somebody that came out of the K-12 and the private sector labor relations world, because the way things happen in higher education is very different from what I would call the typical and normal labor relations strategy that we have. But it's fun and it's engaging and it informs everything now that I do in those other areas. So I have Erie Community College, which is a large unit of full-time faculty, adjuncts, non-teaching professionals, non-teaching technical professionals, and all that entails. I have a second unit at Jamestown Community College, which is the Service Association, the classified workers, which has not had a contract in 5 years. Erie Community College had a contract expire in 2020. And for a lot of reasons, we're having our first bargaining session next week. Let that settle in for a minute. The bargaining approaches that I employ are not dissimilar from what's already been discussed. I think the words that I would use are responsible and intentional in terms of how we approach it. It is very easy to get cynical and to walk in and say, we've done this before, you should know how to do this. Every bargaining is a new opportunity. And on the union side, it's a multi-leveled opportunity. So we are the voice for all of the members, whether they want us to be or not. And in a post-Janus environment, that can get a little tricky. But making sure that we are speaking for every voice at the college is paramount importance. And I know you talked about the creation of your bargaining team. As a union rep, I don't always get to decide who's on the bargaining team. Sometimes it's constitutionally determined, sometimes it's all appointed by the executive board, and sometimes it's just who wants to volunteer. And I don't know about your institutions, but not everybody's running to join the negotiating team in a lot of the places that I work. So sometimes it really is just a committee of the willing, which has its inherent strengths and weaknesses. So my job with my team is to make sure that they understand what it is that we're going through, all of the legal pieces, what we can expect at bargaining, and drafting of the proposals. But that requires that they be informed about everything that their members want, that they're the voice of their members. The one thing I take as the chief negotiator in any of my locals is that the contracts I negotiate, with the exception of one, do not affect me personally. And I recognize that the uniqueness of the union negotiators at the table is that we are bargaining for those people, for the food they'll be able to put on the table for their kids, for the health insurance that their families are going to have, and that doesn't affect me personally as their negotiator, which means they have to make sure, and I have to make sure, that their voices are heard above anything going on in my head about, well, the easy solution here is this. If it's not the right solution, then it's not something I should be advocating. And when I speak of intentionality, that's what I mean. It's about being very intentional about what the needs of each particular bargaining unit member are, and making sure that the team has the internal discipline and the camaraderie within the team to be able to speak up and have the honest conversations that are necessary. I like to think that for every hour I spend at the bargaining table, I'm spending at least 3 hours in preparation with my team, working by myself on the proposals and getting the data and the information necessary to support the proposals. I'm not sure that I can always hold to that 3 to 1. possibility, because the space-time continuum is a real thing. But I do try and make sure that I'm holding to that, because I think it's as much of a benefit for the team to spend time together on its own, not in caucus. I want to be really clear about that. Caucus is a very different environment, but in terms of preparation, that the team has enough time to understand the proposals, understand the relationship with the other side. And my relationship with the other side generally goes well beyond just negotiations. It's a full labor management piece, especially at the higher education level. We have 2 labor management meetings every month. We have a grievance committee meeting every month, and it's all the same people, which is very interesting. And some of them are much more contentious than others. My preference is always to be much more cooperative, but I can be adversarial if I need to be. Some would say I'm usually adversarial. I find myself delightful, so I don't know that that's the case. But in general, we put on the performance that we need to put on in the context. In negotiations, I believe that we need to be as genuine as possible in making sure that we are the voice of our team. So when I started negotiating 30 years ago, I was very much a control enthusiast. I wanted to be the person that was doing the talking. I wanted to be the person that was giving the information across the table and so forth, and I've evolved in that because I'm not an expert on all things. If I have Fred Floss at the table with me, he's going to be talking the economics because he knows that. My job is to empower the members of my team to take ownership of their own specialties. They give the reasons and that we're asking for certain things at the table. If we're focused on academic freedom, I want them to speak to what it means to them as an academic professional, because I can spout that, I can recite that, but it doesn't have the same intrinsic meaning to me as a negotiator that it does to them. So my strategies have evolved over time, but they always come back to the core piece of being very intentional about what it is that we're doing, about what we're putting across our table, being strategic in how we're labeling and characterizing our things. And with the advent of technology and social media, we've had to expand how we interact with our own members away from the table. I like to call it LRS by Googling. So my title is Labor Relations Specialist, and everyone thinks they can be an LRS because they have access to the Google, right? They can look it up and say, this college got this much of a % increase. And so we have these ongoing conversations about what's reality, what can we expect here. So having a lot of the information is key, but knowing the context of that data in relation to the specific employer that we're working with is going to determine whether or not we're successful in how we can prosecute the negotiations, if that's the right word. But I think at its core, it's about being responsible to the members that we represent and who pay the dues that keep us in business, but also being responsible to the process. It is an ongoing relationship. When I work with our new staff, I remind them that it's labor relations specialist, and that building those relationships is key to making sure that we're going to make continual progress as we negotiate time after time and year after year.
Okay. Thank you. We're going to go with Fred now for our economics lesson. Hoping to use Samuelson. What do you use these days?
Oh, Samuelson's dead. Let's see. Here we go. There we go. Well, now for something completely different. For a number of years, Howard Burness and I have come to this conference and talked to and done workshops about iPads and how to use data and how to do all of this. This is sort of an extension of doing a lot of that discussion. Now, the problem I have is I thought we were going to be in a little room with a computer in front of me, so let me, as I go like this, look back a little bit to talk to you about some of this. The amount of data today that the average negotiations team can use has grown immensely, not because the data wasn't there, but because now it's online and it's usable in very simple ways. 10 years ago, I wouldn't have been giving you this lecture. I would have been telling you, here's my card. If you have a problem, call me and I'll get it to you. 10 to 15 years ago, a lot of this data you had to call BLS for, and they sent it on a disk. Today, nobody knows what a disk is. So you can start to see Now, the first type of data that I think we've talked about a lot, and I'm not going to talk about today, is the IPEDS AAUP National Centers data and the SHIO data. Not that I don't think it's important, but that I think that there's other data that I want to talk to you about that you may not have ever heard about, but is now useful. And that's primarily the census, BLS, and BEA data. Let me say a little bit about private data, particularly things like Bloomberg, Mercer's, Moody's. I'm going to keep Kaiser for a special place in all of that. But the idea that you should have to pay huge amounts of money to hire a consultant who's going to give you a report on wages and benefits is probably not a wise expenditure of your money. I'm pretty sure that people on your campuses, both in the administration side and on the labor side, have the ability to do these things now and actually do them very quickly. Some of the slides I'm going to show you took me less than 5 minutes to do, okay? The last thing I'm going to say is that there are contracts, and I'm really looking forward to the National Center putting out all their contracts and being able to look at the language and look at how that all works. Now, with all of this data, now I want to sort of say why you shouldn't use any of it, okay? And it's not that you really shouldn't use any of it, but there's a caveat in all of this. And it's that we're so used to looking at averages. We're so used to looking at categories. And what we forget is that the reality is we're not like any of them. And let me just give you a really simple example. We can go to the IPEDS data and we can break it down in a number of ways with full professor, associate professor, male and female. But what we don't have in any real way is, for example, age of full professor, or how many adjuncts we have in certain different categories of things. We don't have in any strong way with wages and benefits what all the departments are. Now you have that for your individual college and you analyze the heck out of that. But when we get to all of this data, you can't do that. So when you use that, we want to be careful to not try to make it say more than it can say. Okay? It's useful, it's helpful, you need to do it, but it's not going to be the solution. The other thing the data never does is it never gives you the answer. I know that everybody thinks you put stuff into a computer and now with AI, it will give you the answer. You don't have to think anymore. The reality is none of that's going to be true as we go along. So essentially I've said all of that. What I've got here that does it in a little more detail, I only brought 10 because I didn't think we were going to have a big crowd, but I have a primer with everything on it so you'll know where all of the data sets are and the web pages and a little bit of how to actually get to the data. The front page comes off and then it's for my graduate students, so for their thesis. But so you can take it for what it is. If the first 10 that get up here can have it if they want it. If not, then that's fine. But let's go over and look at some of the data. Probably the most misunderstood and least used is the quarterly census of employment and wages data, QCEW. It is, the good part about this compared to a lot of the other data is that it comes out quarterly. That means while you're negotiating, you've got up-to-date data. Some of the data that I'm going to talk to you about later, including the IPEDS and the AAUP data, can be a year or two old. This is going to give you data that's happening in real time. And it's going to be able to give you data not only on industry, but also in a number of other categories that you can sort of look at. And you can see you can make pretty graphs for your negotiations, PowerPoints, by just clicking a button and get all of the states. You can do this for counties and everything else as we go. The reality is it's very simple to go to. Very quickly, type in BLS and data. You'll be taken to that top site up there, along with a lot of others. You press on the one screen, and I know you can't read all of it, but you can click and do a lot of industries. One of the industries is universities and colleges. Isn't that useful? Another one is for community colleges, okay? 6113 is universities, 6112 is colleges. Again, this is sample data that's being collected. It's being collected by the employers. That's going to be important because later I'm going to say, and this is collected from the employees, and guess what? They don't match. But that doesn't mean that it's not important to be able to see what they are and to be able what you can use them for. So as you go along, you can see, you can pick all of this. You can pick New York. You can pick a county. You can pick a metropolitan area. Okay? You can pick a region. So it isn't as if this is just national data. You can get as local or as large as you need to go. And what I would recommend to all of you, just to check the numbers and see if everything's working, is fine, do the county where your college or university is, do the state that you're in, and do the national, see what the differences are. It won't take you that much time, but it'll give you a real understanding of what the trends are in your data. And as I said, you can do this quarterly, and you can go back 10, 20 years as we go through it. As you can see here, I've gone back to 2001. This is now in Excel. You can't read any of it, but that's okay. But the idea is, just underneath that, I created all the growth rates. And that's what the data comes down, so you know what the dollar amounts are in New York State for universities and colleges. The important thing here is this is for all of New York State, and you've got New York City and what the rest of us in New York State do with all data. Rest of New York, okay? So that you can break out New York City and keep the rest of New York in there, and you can see what the growth rates are going. Let me warn you about one thing, and it's particularly important because we're coming out of COVID. We lost lots and lots of people, and now they've come back, and that screws around with the growth rates because they take the total amount of money in wages and salaries and benefits and things, and they divide them by the number of people. Once you lose a bunch of people, the growth rate goes up, then the growth rate goes down. I did this on purpose to warn you about that. You need to be able to look and see some of that. So this is probably the most useful one that you can do. There's also the states usually download this data. BLS actually has a special download for states, so whatever state you're in, if you go labor statistics, whatever, go to their state, look for QCEW, and they'll download it, and you can actually download like 30 years worth of data by quarter. Excel, for the first time, this is my thing that you all need to go back and learn some new Excel. There's something called Power Query. These data sets become so big that up until a few years ago, you would never be able to do anything in Excel, which is why I wouldn't have told you to do this. But now, you can go into Power Query, combine all these data sets, hit load to connection instead of to the Excel sheet, and then it's all sitting out there in the ether, and you can do whatever you want with it in Excel. So there's a lot of different things. You don't need me to run in with R or Python or SAS or whatever we're doing like we used to have to do in the past. That's why I'm saying you can do this. The other one that almost no one knows about is called the employer cost of employee compensation. This is the one that I actually use in all of my court cases, so I know that legally for the lawyers on the team, this is something that we all use to be able to do it. But what the important part about this is, it breaks out not just wages and total benefits, but it breaks out health insurance and it breaks out retirement plans. So if you're looking at the percentages, you can look at all of this. The problem is with this, that it doesn't do states and it doesn't do counties. So you may be somewhat different from all of those, but this gives you presumably a much better breakdown of what the percentages of the different benefits for contracts are going on. And you could look at them and put together percentages, and you can draw pretty pictures to put into your PowerPoint presentation when you're presenting on whichever side of the table you are, so they'll think you're really smart. Okay? The last one I want to talk about that almost nobody knows except that my professor and thesis advisor created, so I must always talk about it, is PEA's Regional Economic Information System. This gives you, by county, by state, it gives you all of the data that you need to calculate wages and benefits. Okay, so whereas the Employment Cost Index and the ECEC can't do that, VEA can do that. Okay, so as we go through that, you can go in and you can hit county metro area, you can do GDP and personal income. You go to personal income, it's called CAIN 4, and all of the stuff is just sitting there waiting for you to use. And you can go back to 1969 for those that were alive then and want to know what was going on. Okay, as we go through that. And again, you just click through a couple of
the comments of my clients, or at least of my clients, well, what do we have a mediation for? Spend all that money. Why can't you settle this deal? And the simple answer is, I can't settle this deal. It's apparent to me that we need, if you want a deal before another 3 years pass, let's bring somebody in. And what do? I typically have the other side and I enter into a mediation agreement, not just a simple form that goes to the Public Employment Relations Board or to the feds, but an agreement with the other side as to agenda, what are the key issues, because we all know a mediator is not going to mediate on 42,000 issues combined between both sides, and we're looking at 4 or 5. Secondly is timing. How quickly do we want this deal done? Under political considerations, getting this quicker or longer? Is the current president up for election? So we address timing as well. And we address how we do this. So we're going to do small group mediation, we're going to do large group mediation. I find particularly at higher education that the teams have to be a bit larger because of the interest of the professorial interest that is expressed at the table. So, but my agreements will spell that out. And that we then also present and ask the other side to agree in this agreement to a summary of negotiations where we've been, what we perceive has been settled and resolved. And we sign that, and that goes to the mediator on the first day of the mediation process, so we're not sitting around wasting time. But I think it's really important to structure the mediation process with an understanding that utilization of mediation is not a sin. I have to convince clients of that all the time, not so much about the money aspect, but about the value to cut a deal across the table. You're not yelling at them enough, you're not being tough enough at the bargaining table, or they're overbearing, and that gets dissipated through the skilled mediators, utilization of splitting the parties, and et cetera. There are various methodologies to calm down the adversarial setting. And I've also used mediation in non-negotiating sessions. So one recently, this isn't a K-12 institution, but I think it equally applies in higher ed. The school district has a policy, as it's required under the federal civil rights statutes, to provide mechanisms for resolution of complaints as a first step. the union decided that they wanted to file 25 civil rights complaints, all of which, respectfully, did not rise to the level of a cognizable civil rights claim. But I was able to convince the client that we have a problem here. There are 25 complaints, maybe not actionable in a court of law, maybe not hostile work environment, that have to be addressed. And what we were able to do, because the LRS in that particular situation is an absolutely terrific person who understands the process and the needs of her client, we were able to bring in a third party, not to litigate over, not to arbitrate over a labor contract breach, but to address this clear problem. And we're now in the midst of this process, and it will take a while. What are the underlying reasons that we got 25 civil rights complaints that are characterized as civil rights complaints, but are complaints? So utilization mediation, both in the negotiating situation as well as non-negotiations, I think is critically important. So turning to, I wanted to review with you a difficult situation that we had about 3 or 4 years ago at NYSUT Community College, who I've represented now for about 30 years. And what had happened there is somebody, probably in 1967, 68, when the Taylor Law was adopted and everybody rushed to negotiations, had the bright idea of putting all governance involving the faculty into the labor contract, which of course puts enormous pressure on the bargaining process, which is supposed to be essentially an economic process, now becomes a political process. And that section in the contract that it focused on in terms of governance was the academic senate at the college. And there was a provision that created the academic senate in the labor contract and also spelled out what the authority of the senate was, primary among which was recommendations for college policy related to curriculum, finances, very, very broadly written. What evolved over the years, apparently, was, and this was early on, before I arrived, the Senate adopted a procedure that gave the Senate, academic senate, which is a very, very active portion of the, related to the NYSUT Community Federation of Teachers, not exactly part of them, but certainly united to a large extent to the union, that provided the ability of the Senate to override a veto of actions of the Senate by the President. That suddenly became the procedure of choice for the Senate in 2017. At the same time, the college is going through middle states. And ultimately, the Middle States Commission makes a determination that the college must be placed on probation for any number, I shouldn't say any number, 2 or 3 issues. One issue was administration lacks appropriate oversight of curriculum, the faculty, etc. Standard 7 of the Middle States Commission standards. Obviously, in part, without saying it, focused on this ability of the academic senate to veto or nullify a veto of a policy determination by the Senate, by the President. Now, to make matters more complicated, we're in the middle of negotiations. Obviously, we have now argument that they could terminate or reverse a presidential determination, middle states and negotiations at the same time. And the reason I raise this is, again, I mean, to an extent, is creativity, and I don't take sole credit for this. We had a very, at the time, a very fine president, a fellow Frederick Senate professor. And we began meeting, myself, in-house counsel, associate of mine, small group on the union side. And ultimately what we came up with, which took a bit of a leap of faith on my part, management is allergic to interest arbitration. Absolutely allergic to it. And in this setting, we were faced with threats of litigation by the union because I composed the resolution of the Board of Trustees declaring that the ability of the academic senate itself to imbue itself with the authority to negate a presidential decision was violative of the law. So, of course, I've got 2 or 3 associates working on the papers. I know from the union side and their union attorney who participated, they were in the midst of preparing litigation. All of that would have been enormously problematic in the context of middle states oversight and review of the institution to get us off of probation. So what did we do? We took a leap of faith and agreed to proceed to interest arbitration, utilizing someone many of you may know, Howard Ingerman, and after a lengthy hearing, Howard issued a determination that was really absolutely terrific. And what he did was he granted the union, as an interest arbitration award, the right to appeal the decision of a decision of the president to reverse an action of the academic senate on the grounds that it was arbitrary, capricious, or unreasonable, utilizing the standards of middle states, another standard, best interests of the college, and any provision of regulation of law, because of course we're a public institution. That was not just simply a mechanism where we had to choose whether we were going to follow. It was an advisory, it was binding. That fully resolved that issue, satisfied middle states. There were other things the college had to do. I don't want you to think that was the only reason that they had been on probation. And the faculty was working very hard to assist the college in getting up for probation. When we got off of probation, having met Standard 7 and these other issues, it resolved the practical issues that I won't bore you with the details of where the president had issued some vetoes. It resolved the Board of Trustees' concerns, of course, based on my advice that this sufficiently protected the institution, and proof positive was middle states' acceptance of it, problem solved. And the point I'm making is there was no other way to do this. We talked about regular mediation, we talked about fact-finding, we talked about 2 mediators, we talked about all sorts of different approaches. The only one that really ultimately resolved this was finality through interest arbitration of that issue. And it also had the impact that while we vigorously litigated this in the hearing before Howard, I think it toned down the parties' positions, including myself, because we knew that we had somebody we could trust and were given the opportunity to lay out all the concerns we had as did the union. So that, I think, relatively creative utilization, again, of a third party, and the leap of faith, which takes, one of the other panelists was talking about, relating to your own client, convincing your own client that it's not the end of the world, and we had to engage in a lot of that, as well as I know the union did with the leadership of the union leadership. So took care of the problem, and I guess the message I would suggest is not to be afraid of creativity and not be afraid of taking a leap, particularly where you're going to be battling this out in court, and a guy in black robes is going to come out, or a gal in black robes, and they're not going to know anything about labor relations. They were probably intellectual property lawyers or real estate lawyers who were active in a political party, and they're sitting there, and you're remaking the wheel, and it takes a long time, and a lot of them get very cranky and don't want to hear all that labor stuff. Tell me what you think, and then I'll make a determination. So you've got binding determination and enrichment of Ingerman Smith, and you're going to get a binding determination, of course, subject to appeal, which delays things in the middle of a middle states commission review. So I can't urge you enough not to be afraid on those kinds of issues. The last item, and then I think we'll turn to questions, again is, I serve as chairman of the New York State Judicial Institute on Professionalism and Law, which is a chief judge institute, and we worry about issues of professionalism in the legal profession. And one of the hallmarks, I think, of achievement of where professionalism should be is the duty to assist your client. And is the duty to explain all the facts in a dispassionate way of where this is going, this particular issue that you're facing. And I think that is equally applicable to the very tough job, as was explained earlier, of attorneys or LRSs in higher education, dealing with the highly educated clients they deal with, who are teaching people. So you've got to, and I confront a different mixture of professionals, non-professionals, who are political appointees, at least the representation of community college I represent. I formerly represented, unfortunately went out of business, but a small liberal arts college on the island. But same thing with the board of trustees. So the duty, an attorney's duty, and I think I'm going to review LRSs who in many respects I think would make terrific lawyers, and view that with the same ethical duty that attorneys have to assist the client to understand and explain so that they can make an informed determination is a critical role of the representative away from the table. I've avoided any real conversation about what I do at the table, and which in measure relates to whether there's rocks being thrown by either side or that they often have a cup of tea together. So I've left that to our other panelists. But those are the 4 items I wanted to cover with you.
So I think I'm going to throw out a question or two, and we'll open up to folks. If you have questions, you have a panel here, you want to throw some live situations at them. I think one thing that we didn't, I appreciate everyone talking about the newer units, the grad employees, the adjunct part-time faculty, the undergraduate students. And I think one thing that we can touch on, which I'd be curious to hear people's thoughts about, is I've noticed much more of a push, and also seeing it now in the nonprofit sector as a mediator or whatever, seeing more and more open bargaining. And for those who are not familiar with bargaining, it's like when the CIO bargaining committees are doing actual bargaining, but then it is open to every member who wants to come show up. And since the pandemic with Zoom, it's a lot of people Zoom bargaining, everyone can show up, can travel to the bargaining. Before the pandemic, people would come to the bargaining physically. So I'm curious to hear the panelists' points of views, if they've experienced that, how they think it impacts behaviors at the table. Does it, I'll just leave it open and have whoever wants to start first.
I guess I'll make a comment. Not that I was involved with bargaining. I wasn't doing bargaining myself, but I was recently observing some bargaining at an institution that I'm doing some work with that was conducted on Zoom, and having grown up 2 generations ago and been raised by folks, I'm looking at my former colleague Barbara Edmonds from DC 37, who was raised by many of the same people in the labor relations world that I was in the city, who were people who were formative in public sector bargaining in the city. The concept of open bargaining and bargaining sessions that had outsiders is anathema, and it's shocking and it's scary. And so to have watched bargaining on Zoom from my living room the other night until 3 or 4 in the morning with my fresh coffee brewing was shocking. And in some ways I give credit to the negotiators on both sides of the table and the teams on both sides of the table. And I think it's part of a brave new world, as my brief comment about communications earlier and the way management in particular, I think now needs to think differently about communications. I think everyone is thinking differently about bargaining. I don't know where it goes and what I think about it, but I think that there's no choice. I think those of us who are dinosaurs, and there are many of us as I look around the room on both sides of the table, and some of you know exactly who I'm speaking. I think we don't have any choice, because I think that we are close to the end of our careers, and we're not the ones who are controlling, the scripts anymore. But I kind of watched with a certain amount of trepidation and thought about those bargaining sessions where I might have been a little glib, or I might have been a little fresh, or I might have been a little tart. I do have that tendency, as Barbara might be able to point out, and I think one has to be much more careful when you're doing bargaining on Zoom. And I wonder the extent to which it has a chilling effect on certain things.
Chilling in what way?
In terms of some amount of natural back and forth. I think that perhaps on the union side, a certain amount of, I don't want to say acting out, a certain amount of vociferousness is acceptable. I'm not sure on the administration side that degree of vociferousness on Zoom would be equally as acceptable. Whereas if it's not on Zoom and you get a little carried away, I think that you might be able to get a pass on it. I don't think you would get the same pass on Zoom. Let's just put it that way. I'm yielding the mic.
So it intrigues me and it scares the crap out of me in equal measures. So I have many of the same concerns that if we're doing it in front of a large audience, it becomes more performative than substantive, and that lengthens the process, and I think it takes something away from the richness of the conversation that you can have in a controlled setting at a bargaining table. That said, it is a new era, and people have much greater interest in us being transparent about how we do the work. So I think that a well-managed open bargaining is something that is going to become more the norm than the exception. I've never done one. We've talked about it in a number of my locals, and the teams have always made the call that they weren't ready for it, or their locals weren't ready for it. I have some legal questions about whether the open bargaining, if they're all participating, do they then become members of the team for the purposes of ratification and so forth, that give me great pause, especially for public sector folks in New York State and some of the recent rulings by PERB in that regard. So I want to do it. I may retire first, I don't know, and then I'll watch it. But I think it is something that has to be factored in as our bargaining units move forward, and that it is going to become more often the reality rather than the exception.
I think it's going to be interesting. At UUP, not only did we have what we call the large table, but we also had the small table. And the idea of the small table was, let's take a couple of people, put them in a room, not let them out, and try to be creative about coming up with solutions without having to feel like whatever you said was going to be recorded, and then that was going to be the final act. I wonder if, as you get to more normalized open meetings, that you're going to have to see a lot more of that, where either the chief negotiator, somebody else is on both sides, are scripting exactly what's going to happen that people are going to see, and then what happens when somebody breaks the pattern, and whether that messes things up or not. So I think I suspect in the long run it's not going to do anything, you're not going to get anywhere different, but it may be a lot more painful to get to where you're not getting anything different.
A large part of my practice is K-12, so I have to make a point relative to K-12. I'm thinking of the school boards, where we have members of Moms of Liberty running for the school board, people who think that if you wear a union button, you're a communist. And we have open bargaining. The first thing they're going to say is, I want to be there. And it will turn into a disaster. That's the current political climate. Maybe things will change. I also would measure this against my long experience. I mean, how many times have I settled the contract in the hallway with the LRS in a private conversation and come back and worked out the deal? There's nothing like personal contact, and I know I've done a lot of Zoom negotiations, doing something from Europe at one point with CSA. It's great, it saves time, it's great for prep sessions, it's great to kick things around with your side, but there's nothing like face-to-face. And if it's open, I just can't imagine it wouldn't turn into a rock-throwing experience.
One, yeah, question, comment? Yeah, sure. There's a mic there, I think, if you need it. But I don't know if it's on.
Hi, my name is Chad Carroll. I'm internally organizer of SU Group 519. So I represent Leslie University and Tufts University. And I started my career there for 7 years, and I've done nothing but open bargaining. It's not, I'm pretty sure, and being right now. I've done it in person and on Zoom. No one is recorded. We do have wrong rules. We do have that you don't pose anything unless it's vetted by the bargaining committee and talk about it. So you have to have rules just like a regular bargaining session. I prefer it because it is very transparent and no scripted. I have had a great time for the 7 years of doing that. So my question is, why is it that people who have not done that have an innate apprehension to that, when it does bring more unity and it's transformative for the members who go through that? When they're not there silently, they can participate fully, they can talk about the proposals fully. I do it like you. I'm there to make sure it doesn't go off the rails, but my members run the show, and I don't stop them unless they're doing something illegal, and I've not had that happen, and I've done it for 7 years, so a pretty long time, but pretty short as well, compared to what you've been doing.
I really think it's a generational thing.
Yeah,
I just think it's a generational thing. I think we're dinosaurs.
I just wanted to add, from my perspective, I was doing it towards the end of my time at the UAW, and from my perspective now as a mediator, I've seen it in all different permutations in person. Nurse bargaining in New York happens with open sessions, and those are in person because, as the nurses say, we're at the hospital throughout COVID, and it's coming in person. They got a point. And I've seen them happen all different ways. They happen like ground rules, like I know where the committees, the elective bargaining committees, caucus with their members who are participating, who are observing the open bargaining, and they may have them vet some questions that they may want to ask or something, or they actually use them as a resource to expand on something. Likewise, in Zoom, what I've seen is there's been agreements between management and union about everyone has to have their cameras on. Only members of the team, respective teams will speak in joint session, but then they go back in caucus and they may come back and they say, Scott would like to, has a question or something like that, or they may ask the question on my behalf if I was the rank and file member. So it takes different ways, but I actually think, I'm seeing more and more people doing it and having to adjust to get used to it. It was an adjustment for me. I'd never done it before, but now I'd be totally comfortable with it, having lived through it most of the times. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Richard Manning. I spoke yesterday, I think, and I'll just remind you I'm from Florida, which will make some sense out of my question.
But also Canada, right?
Yes. Well, yes.
Yeah, the state route. Congratulations.
Those happy days. In regard to the open bargaining, I think there are measures short of that which have some of the benefits without some of the risks, which are just, the session will be videotaped and then posted online so everyone can see how everyone else, everyone in the session is behaving, and that might keep people from misbehaving, and it might also have the benefit of educating your members who are going to ultimately vote on the contract in such a way that they might basically see what's going on, but also be able to recognize sort of really disparate power in the bargaining positions, and understand better what they might agree to in a contract and who they should be mad at for the way things are going. That said, I want to ask, I need your help, and I'm going to ask for your help by way of an all too real hypothetical. Okay, so imagine that you're the chief negotiator for a university, a public university, or it really doesn't, I think, matter for this question, or for the union at a public university. And the administration is in the position in which they could successfully bargain because of legislation that has been passed to impose, or more or less impose, or get a contract in which there is no effective arbitration for grievances. So, so ultimately, the decision whether the contract has been violated is determined unilaterally by one party to the contract, namely administration. How would you, either from the standpoint of the representing labor or representing the employer, how would you argue to the employer that it is not in their interest to have a contract in which they have that unilateral kind of power? Maybe the case can't be made. Maybe it is in their interest necessarily, but I'm inclined to think that it isn't because of various consequences having a contract like that would have for recruiting faculty, et cetera, et cetera. Totally disempowering the union makes it a less attractive workplace. That's a bad consequence. So how would you make the case to people who have a dagger that they ought not to stick it into the guts of their opponent in that way?
I'll take it. I would go back to the roots of labor, right? The ability to take grievances to arbitration is a quid pro quo for the no strike clause. So you take that to a different level of it means we're not going to be in your face about every issue that we should have been able to grieve. So a lot of it will depend on the willingness and the advocacy of your members. But the short answer I would have is if we don't have the ability to arbitrate it, we still have the ability to argue it. We can argue it publicly and we can argue it forcefully. So do you want these measures handled in a routine way by somebody that, objectively will come in and make a fair decision? Or do you just want to make a bad decision and we will call you out on it every time? This presumes that we have the support of the faculty and that they will show up and we will do rallies at the president's house. So this would be the obnoxious part of me. So, but we can do those things. There's a reason why grievance and arbitration have become a standard and a norm, because it gives a process to how we resolve disputes. When you take that process away, we're back to the situation where anything goes. So are we stopping cars on campus to let them know that we have this problem, or are we going to find a measured way to approach it? I'm not sure that that's persuasive, and I don't know what the law is in Florida. So in New York, I would argue you might still have action for breach of contract or in Article 78. I'm not an attorney, I'm just an LRS, but I often pretend to higher aspirations. So I would look to see what are the other legal avenues that we might still have.
Strike is not one of them.
But action is, right? So we can still talk about action and making their lives difficult. They're big picture, you know, the bad people making this bad decision. We can still make their lives difficult. We can still point those things out. We can take action within the bounds of legality, if you insist. And we can do that. But I mean, that's how we got it in the first place. It wasn't. I've had employers tell me that this was a gift. It wasn't. It was earned, and there are good reasons for it. We just have to remember what those reasons were and fight for them again.
I would tell you that a strike is reasonable, and you should do it then. Because the reality is there may be consequences, but that doesn't mean that you don't go on strike. And we've seen that basically throughout all of labor history. They were not always told they were illegal. We got the Taylor Law because they struck, and in this city, that meant there would be no subways if they didn't hire everybody back. So they had to figure out what to do. The other thing I think is you need to look at every federal statute you can. It's just file lawsuits to the point that it is so expensive for them to deal with it that they're going to have to see that this is a much better option, because that's the reality before arbitration happened. This all goes to court. It takes a lot of time. It helps some of our friends maybe with their legal fees, but which isn't necessarily a bad thing because I get paid doing some of that too. So, but I think that arbitration is the easy way out for them. It's the easy way out for everybody. If you don't want to take it, you're really going to make it a mess.
Yeah, I'm curious what what the consequences of the strike would be. I know in New York we haven't had strikes, except they did have one at our faculty a few years ago. But by and large, even in New York, the penalties are significantly sufficient, I think, to have led unions away from utilization of that tool. And I knowing who the governor is in Florida, I'm guessing that it's a pretty wicked consequence if they went on strike. But what I was going to suggest is, sometimes you have to take a half a step as opposed to a full step. Maybe if you've got sufficient number of complaints floating out there that management is cognizant of, is, perhaps, and again, I sound like a salesman for the American Academy of Mediators and Arbitrators, but maybe a suggestion of a two-part process: mediation and advisory arbitration. Because very often, advisory arbitration, while it gives the parties the solace that they don't have to follow it, it does present a learned, presumably, decision that both parties can read about and think about in terms of what they're doing. So it doesn't give you complete relief, but it gives you maybe the beginnings of it when you get a sufficient number of advisory arbitration awards that even very management-oriented management starts saying, wait a minute, there's something wrong here we need to address. So that would be my suggestion. I don't know if advisory arbitration is also banned by your statute. And the other thing too is, that was mentioned before, every state, I think, has what's called a certiorari proceeding, which is give me the record. In New York, it's called Article 78. So maybe you have to swallow hard and spend some money on legal fees and bring a couple of those cases as well. But I'd really try the mediation route, suggestion, and maybe advisory arbitration.
Okay.
My colleagues have all taken the high road. I would not. If I had to convince my administration, this really sounds like it's an internal issue with having to convince the administration about why they should not take advantage of what they think has been given to them on a silver platter to get rid of the arbitration provision. And I think where I would go if I wanted to convince the administration, if I were the in-house person, is I would go straight for their own self-interest and construct a series of arguments about why it's not in their self-interest to do this, and why it's in their self-interest to maintain the arbitration provisions, including the fact that it gives them something to hide behind by having this external neutral to blame, for lack of a better word, for these decisions related to the faculty. And I would go through and line up, the decisions and the statistics and go down that road of going after their self-interest. So on that note, I'm not taking the high road.
All right, well, thanks very much. That was extremely helpful.
And on that note, it is 3 o'clock, so I want to thank our panel for